In 1992, truck driver Jake Hoffman vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a mysterious absence and whispers of a new life. 20 years later, his truck is found submerged in an abandoned quarry, with his body still strapped in the driver's seat. But it's a receipt in his pocket. 2 coffees, 2 sandwiches, time-stamped 11:47 p.m. That turns everything upside down. Someone else was with him that night, and someone has been hiding the truth all along. The search for answers is only just beginning. On a typical evening in 1992, Jake Hoffman, an experienced truck driver, sat in his Peterbilt at a Texaco gas station off Route 287, doing his final checks before hitting the road. His truck was loaded with machine parts, bound for Dallas. Jake was in a hurry. The distant horizon barely revealed the faint line of the sky, and he knew ahead of him lay a long road. His life had always been one of endless travel, work, and homecoming. The station was quiet, dark, and nearly empty. Jake checked the tire pressure and oil levels, routine tasks that had become second nature. His life, it seemed, was one long stretch of highway, and he was used to these moments. But tonight, something felt different. Jake couldn't shake an uneasy feeling that seemed to cling to him. Maybe it was just fatigue or the long journey ahead. He sighed, reached for a cigarette, but didn't light it. His habit, usually his comfort, didn't help tonight. He called Linda, his wife. They always kept in touch, even when he was on the road. He reassured her that everything was fine, that he'd be on the highway soon. But as the call ended, Jake felt an odd shift in the air. Linda didn't notice it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this trip was different. It was as if his life, this road, was something bigger than just another haul. It was something beyond his control. When he slid back into the driver's seat, everything seemed normal again. He started the engine and pulled out of the station, his truck rolling into the night. But that feeling of unease lingered, an unshakable presence. Jake didn't take a taxi, nor did he switch vehicles. He drove off in his Peterbilt, the truck that had always carried him, knowing this trip would be his last. Jake's truck was last seen rolling out of the Texaco station, its large figure slowly fading into the dark expanse of Route 287. The sound of the Peterbilt's engine was swallowed up by the vast emptiness of the Texas night. Linda had stayed up late, waiting for his call, as she always did when he was on the road. The phone never rang. When morning came, she glanced at the clock by their bed. It was already 9 a.m. Jake should have been home by then. She reached for her phone and dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. Her stomach twisted with unease. Jake wasn't the type to forget a call, let alone not check in after a long night on the road. She tried again. Still nothing. The sinking feeling in her chest refused to go away. He's probably just busy, she told herself, trying to calm the growing concern. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jake had been driving for years, and although there had been occasional delay or mechanical issue, it wasn't like him to vanish without a word. Linda forced herself to start her day as usual. She brewed coffee, made breakfast, and tried to ignore the nagging worry. But as the hours ticked by and still no word from Jake, her anxiety intensified. By late afternoon, she couldn't pretend everything was fine any longer. Linda called the police, explaining that Jake had been missing for an entire day. The officers reassured her that there was likely a simple explanation. They suggested perhaps Jake had stopped somewhere, or maybe had gotten stuck with a breakdown. But something in Linda's heart didn't accept that. Jake was a professional driver, meticulous about his rig, always prepared for anything. He wouldn't have just disappeared. The thought of something bad happening to him lingered in the back of her mind. As the days passed, she began to fear that the worst might have happened, but no one could give her any answers. The search began in earnest, with local authorities combing the highways and byways looking for any trace of him. Yet it was as if Jake had simply vanished into thin air. No wreckage, no tire marks, no sign of an accident. His truck was gone, and so was he. For weeks, Linda clung to the belief that Jake was out there somewhere, maybe lying low or even injured and unable to call for help. She refused to believe the alternative. But as time wore on and the investigators found nothing, the possibility of Jake simply leaving became harder to ignore. Rumors started circulating in town, some of which Linda found hard to believe, but they refused to stop. People said Jake might have had a secret life, a mistress, or some unresolved issues with Linda. Maybe he just decided to leave. Some even suggested that Jake had simply disappeared to start fresh somewhere far away. The whispers stung. Linda didn't want to believe them, but the doubt started to gnaw at her. Was it possible? Could Jake have done something so reckless? Could have just up and left her and Emma behind without a second thought? No, she refused to entertain those ideas. Jake loved them. She was sure of that. But as the weeks turned into months and no new information surfaced, even she started to question what had really happened to her husband. 8 months later, the insurance company settled the claim, writing Linda a check for $700,000. The investigation, they said, had turned up nothing substantial, and it seemed most likely that Jake had either run off or, worse, had met some tragic end that would never be known. Linda accepted the check, but she couldn't accept the closure it offered. She wasn't ready to give up, not like this. Jake was not the man they were making him out to be. She couldn't just believe he had abandoned them. That wasn't who he was. She knew that in her heart. But what else could she do? The town moved on quickly. Jake's disappearance became just another forgotten story, filed away in the back of people's minds. The gossip faded, and Linda was left with the wreckage of her own mind. Emma grew up without her father, but she, too, came to believe the story that Jake had left him. It was easier for her that way. The stories of his love and devotion to their family began to blur, and soon Jake became nothing more than a distant memory. A man who, according to people around them, simply chose to walk away. Emma learned to live without him, and Linda learned to function in a world where her husband was no longer there. But Linda's mind never stopped searching for answers. She couldn't just accept that Jake had abandoned them. Something about it didn't feel right. There had to be more to the story. Every time she went to bed, she couldn't help but replay the last few days in her mind, wondering if she had missed something. She went over their conversations, his behavior before he left, his actions. Could she have seen something that she had overlooked? No, she had been paying attention, hadn't she? Still, the questions lingered, the answers elusive. Emma started to grow older and asked less about her father. She became absorbed in her own life, and as the years passed, Linda, though she never truly accepted the loss, grew quieter. The sting of Jake's disappearance was still there, but it became easier to bury it deep inside. Maybe the insurance payout was her attempt to move on, to give Emma a future free of the lingering weight of Jake's mystery. But even as she tried to bury the past, Linda could never forget the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. Jake hadn't left on his own. No, something had happened to him. Someone had made him disappear. It had been 20 years since Jake Hoffman's disappearance. The years had passed slowly for Linda and Emma, but the wound from Jake's vanishing still felt fresh in Linda's heart. She had come to terms with his absence in her own way, quietly carrying the weight of the unanswered questions. Emma, now grown, had long since stopped asking about her father. Linda had raised her daughter, trying to make sense of a life that was altered so abruptly. Time had dulled the sharp edge of grief, but the unease never truly left Linda. She had rebuilt a life without Jake, finding peace in the routine of everyday living. But the sense of something unfinished, something unspoken, lingered like an old scar that refused to heal. In the years following Jake's disappearance, she had searched, quietly and without much hope, for any clue that might explain what had happened to him. She had written letters to truckers' unions, contacted old colleagues of Jake's, and even consulted private investigators. But every lead led to nothing. There was no new information, no new theories. The case had been forgotten by the authorities, and the small town had moved on. Still, Linda couldn't fully shake the feeling that something was wrong. In October 2012, a development in the town brought something unexpected to light. Garrison Quarry, a long-abandoned mining site on the outskirts of town, was being drained for industrial expansion. The plan was to clear the site for a new development, and workers began the tedious process of emptying the water that had pooled in the quarry over the years. It was a slow, methodical process, one that hardly raised any eyebrows at first. No one expected anything unusual to come from it. But one morning, as workers were going about their business, they made a discovery that would send shockwaves to the quiet town. As the murky water began to recede, a large shape emerged from the depths. At first, it was unrecognizable, just a mass of rust and grime, but as the water level lowered, it became clear. It was a 1987 Peterbilt, the very same make and model of Jake Hoffman's truck. The vehicle had been submerged for decades, hidden beneath layers of silt and mud, and in the driver's seat, still strapped in place, was Jake. The workers stared in disbelief. It didn't make sense. How had Jake's truck ended up here? And why hadn't anyone found it before? No one had thought to look in this particular quarry, not since the late 70s when it had been shut down. The truck, though covered in grime and water damage, seemed almost untouched by time. But it was the sight of Jake's body, still strapped into the seat as though he had never left, that sent a chill through the workers. The eerie stillness of the scene, combined with the fact that the truck had been hidden here all these years, made it clear that this was no ordinary discovery. Linda received a call just hours later. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her heart raced as the officer explained that Jake's truck had been found. She wanted to believe it was a mistake, that this was some kind of cruel joke, but the voice on the other end was insistent. They had found the truck, and Jake was in it. The discovery set off a series of events that would eventually lead Linda down a path she hadn't anticipated. The truck was towed to the local station, where the investigation began. The medical examiner arrived to perform a routine check of the body. At first, the cause of death seemed unclear. Jake's body was badly decomposed, hidden for so long beneath the water's surface. But the most chilling detail emerged later. The examiner found a small bullet hole in the back of Jake's skull, nearly invisible at first, but unmistakable when discovered. It was a clean shot, fired at close range, a deliberate killing, not an accident. The medical examiner found it almost by accident. As they sifted through the remains of Jake's clothing, they discovered something else that struck them as odd, a receipt in the pocket of his jacket. It was a simple receipt, nothing remarkable at first glance. 2 coffees, 2 sandwiches, time stamped 11:47 p.m. Jake had never bought 2 of anything. The realization struck like a blow. Someone else had been in that truck with Jake, someone who would share that meal, someone who knew exactly where to leave Jake's truck. The discovery of the receipt raised questions that no one had thought to ask before. Who had been with Jake that night? And why had they chosen Garrison Quarry, a place long since abandoned and forgotten, as the site to hide his truck? Whoever had been involved knew the area, knew where to hide Jake's truck in plain sight, and knew it would take years before anyone would find it. The investigation into Jake's death took on a new urgency. Authorities began to question whether Jake's disappearance had been something more sinister than a simple case of him leaving town. They began to look into the circumstances surrounding his death and the identity of the person who had shared that last meal with him. But with so many years having passed, leads were hard to come by. The quarry had been used for nothing more than industrial waste for decades. No one had thought to search it for anything else. Linda could barely comprehend the magnitude of what she was hearing. The discovery of the truck, the bullet wound, and the receipt. It was all too much. She had spent 20 years living with the uncertainty of what had happened to her husband, but now the answers were starting to surface, albeit in a way she had never imagined. Jake's disappearance, once dismissed as an act of abandonment, was now a murder investigation. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but Linda knew the hardest part was still to come. Uncovering the truth about what had happened to Jake that night and who was responsible for taking him from her. She had never believed that Jake had abandoned her. Now, she had the proof that he hadn't. The news of Jake's truck being discovered had sent shockwaves through the town, but for Linda, the discovery only deepened the mystery. As the investigation progressed, every detail about Jake's disappearance became more unsettling. The small bullet hole at the back of his skull was the first real clue that something sinister had occurred, but it was a receipt found in Jake's jacket pocket that truly began to unravel the story. 2 coffees, 2 sandwiches, time stamped 11:47 p.m. That receipt held more weight than anyone could have imagined. The discovery of the receipt sent ripples through the investigation. The timestamp, 11:47 p.m., was critical. Linda was certain that Jake hadn't bought 2 meals in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He was a man of routine, someone who always stuck to the basics when on the road. 1 coffee, 1 meal. The receipt suggested that, at some point before he vanished, Jake had been accompanied by someone else. Someone who had been with him at the gas station. Someone who had shared that late-night meal, and more importantly, someone who had known exactly where to hide the truck. The investigators soon began to reframe the case. What had initially been treated as a possible gone rogue scenario, with theories of Jake running away to start a new life, now looked much darker. They looked into the food receipt. 2 coffees and 2 sandwiches. It was nothing out of the ordinary for a trucker, but it was out of character for Jake to purchase 2 of anything. He had always been solitary on the road, content with his own company, never one to indulge in extravagance of shared meals. Linda's mind raced. Who could have been with Jake that night? The more she thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. Jake had never been the kind of man to let someone in easily. He had always been private, secretive about things he didn't want others to know. So, who could have gotten close enough to him to share a meal? And why? What was their connection? It wasn't long before the investigators started to take the lead. They began sifting through Jake's past, looking for anyone who might have had a motive to harm him. They spoke to people from his past, his colleagues, the regulars at truck stops, but no one seemed to know anything out of the ordinary. Jake had kept to himself, but that receipt told a different story. The investigators realized they needed to dive deeper, especially into the time and place indicated on the receipt. The timestamp on the receipt, 11:47 p.m., was crucial. The gas station where Jake had stopped was located off Route 287, a relatively quiet stretch of highway. It was the kind of place that truckers passed through without much thought, and it didn't have a history of any criminal activity. But the fact that Jake had been there at such a late hour, and that he'd shared that moment with someone else, raised more questions than answers. As they dug deeper, they discovered that the Garrison quarry, where Jake's truck had been found, had been long abandoned. The quarry had been a known spot for the occasional dump of unwanted materials, but it hadn't been in use for years. No one would have thought to search there, and the fact that Jake's truck had been hidden there, submerged in the water, suggested that the person who had put it there had knowledge of the area. The discovery of the truck's location, combined with the receipt, made it clear Jake's disappearance had been carefully planned by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They had known Jake's habits, where he would stop, and exactly where to hide the truck. Linda couldn't stop thinking about the receipt. There was something haunting about the fact that it had been found in Jake's jacket after all these years, perfectly preserved under the silt. She tried to piece together the moments leading up to Jake's death. His final meal, his last moments before the inevitable had caught up with him. Who had been the second person? Was it someone from his past? Someone he trusted? Or was it a stranger who had taken advantage of his routine? Someone who had lured him into a trap? Days passed, and the investigators worked tirelessly, tracking down leads. They tried to piece together the lives of everyone who had interacted with Jake before he disappeared, hoping to find someone who had been with him that night. But every lead seemed to fizzle out. No one came forward. No one who knew anything about the second person, the one who had shared the meal with Jake. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Linda couldn't just sit idly by. She couldn't accept that the investigation would die out again, the way it had when Jake first went missing. She began to look through old photos, old receipts, anything she'd find that might give her a clue about the mystery surrounding her husband's death. She spent hours alone in her bedroom, piecing together the fragments of her memories. It was during one of these nights, when she was poring over old papers, that she remembered something. There had been a name that kept popping up in the back of her mind, a name from Jake's past, someone he had mentioned in passing once or twice, someone he had worked with years ago, a fellow trucker. Linda had never paid much attention to the conversations about the man, but something in the back of her mind told her that this man might be the key to the mystery. She couldn't shake the feeling that this person was the one who had been with Jake that night. This man had to know something. The receipt had been a small but telling piece of the puzzle. Linda knew she couldn't stop until she uncovered the full truth. Someone had been in that truck, and they had left behind a trail that she was determined to follow, no matter where it led. The more she thought about it, The more she realized, the answer she sought might not just lie in the receipt, but in the man who had shared that last meal with Jake. Linda had spent weeks poring over every shred of information she could find about Jake's life before he disappeared. The investigation into his death had reopened old wounds, but it also unearthed new, unsettling questions. The discovery of the receipt, combined with the hidden location of the truck, had already cast a long shadow over the idea that Jake had simply run off. Now, Linda was starting to believe there was far more to her husband's disappearance than anyone had ever realized. The name that had been floating around the back of her mind for days finally hit Linda with a jolt. Eddie Harris. The name was barely a whisper in Jake's past, but it had appeared several times in a few conversations they'd had in the years before he vanished. Linda hadn't thought much of Eddie before. He had been just another name, another old acquaintance Jake had mentioned from time to time. But as Linda went back over scraps of information she had, it occurred to her that Eddie Harris could very well be the person who had been with Jake the night he disappeared. Eddie was a former trucker, someone Jake had worked with briefly before going independent. They had crossed paths a few times, but Jake had never spoken highly of him. Linda had always brushed it off, thinking Jake was just being his usual private self. But now, with everything that happened, the fact that Eddie had never come up during the investigation felt wrong. He had to be a part of this story. Linda remembered that Jake had mentioned Eddie once, in passing, but it was enough to trigger something inside her. He had warned her, in one of their rare conversations about work, that Eddie had a reputation for being reckless, for getting into trouble with the law, and for never quite fitting in with the other drivers. Jake had never gone into much detail, but Linda had a nagging suspicion that Eddie Harris was more than just a background character in Jake's past. He had been a part of something that Linda couldn't yet understand. As she began to dig deeper into Eddie's life, she found that he had a history of criminal activity. He had been arrested a few times for minor offenses, always keeping a low profile afterward. He was a drifter, never staying in one place for too long, which explained why he hadn't been on anyone's radar during the investigation. Linda felt a strange sense of urgency as she researched him further. She had to know more. Eddie had worked for a number of different trucking companies, but each time he had been let go, either because of reckless driving or because of his tendency to be involved in shady dealings. Jake had known that, but he had never spoken about it directly to Linda. He hadn't trusted Eddie, and Linda realized now that Jake's wariness had been more than just a passing dislike. There had been something deeper there, something Jake had never shared with her. But why? Linda wondered, had Eddie been with Jake that night? Was it just coincidence that they had met up again, or had it been planned? As Linda pieced together the timeline, she started to realize that Jake's route that night wasn't random either. Quarry, a place so secluded that it hadn't been used since the late 70s, had been chosen carefully. It had been a place that Eddie would have known well. The more Linda thought about it, the clearer it became that the quarry was not just a random location. It was chosen because it was hidden, remote, and most importantly, forgotten. No one would think to look there. Linda's mind raced as she connected the dots. Eddie must have known about the quarry's isolation, its long-standing abandonment, and Jake, being the professional driver that he was, wouldn't have thought anything of it when Eddie suggested they stop there. The two men had likely planned it all out, a secluded spot to talk, share a meal, maybe even do business. But something had gone horribly wrong. Eddie had shot Jake. That much seemed clear. The receipt in Jake's pocket, the bullet wound in the back of his skull, and the remote location of the truck, they all pointed to a carefully orchestrated murder. Linda couldn't ignore the growing dread in her chest as she thought about what happened next. Eddie must have left the quarry afterward, and Jake's truck had been hidden there, out of sight, for 20 long years. But why? Why wait so long? The answer, Linda realized, lay in Eddie's knowledge of the quarry's history. He had known that, if he waited long enough, the quarry would be forgotten, and the truck would be lost to time. It wasn't until the quarry was drained for industrial purposes that anyone would find it. The more Linda uncovered, the more she began to understand the full scope of the conspiracy that had been unfolding around her. Eddie had planned Jake's murder, but there was still a piece of the puzzle missing. What was his motive? Why kill Jake in such a cold, calculated way? Linda knew she needed to find Eddie. He was the key to unraveling everything. She couldn't let this go. Jake's death had been a carefully planned execution, and Eddie was the only person who could explain why it had happened. Linda set out to find Eddie, to track him down and confront him. She didn't know where he was now, or if he was even still alive, but she had to try. She had to know the truth, no matter where it led. The quiet town, the peaceful life she had tried to build after Jake's disappearance, had all been a lie. Now, she had to dig into the past, uncover the secrets that had been buried with Jake's body in the quarry. As Linda prepared to search for Eddie, she was filled with a sense of finality. She had been living in the shadow of Jake's disappearance for 2 decades, but now, with the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together, the truth was within reach, and she was determined to find it. Linda stood at the edge of Garrison Quarry, the same desolate, forgotten place where Jake's truck had been buried for 20 years. The sun was setting behind her, casting long shadows across the land, but it felt like the shadows would never fully recede. Her body trembled with a mixture of anticipation and fear, as at the weight of everything she had discovered in the past weeks, the lies, the secrets, the painful truth had finally come to a head. The hunt for Eddie Harris had led her down an even darker path than she had imagined. The more she uncovered about him, the more she understood how deep his ties to Jake's disappearance went. It wasn't just a random murder. It was personal. Eddie had orchestrated the whole thing, and for reasons Linda hadn't yet fully pieced together, he had wanted Jake dead. She had found Eddie, or rather, she thought she had. He had changed his name, moved several times, and lived in the shadows of his past, always one step ahead of those searching for him. Linda had tracked him down to a rundown apartment on the edge of the city, but when she arrived, it was too late. Eddie was gone, just as elusive as he had been when he first crossed paths with Jake. The final conversation with the officer who had been leading the investigation came rushing back to her. The officer, a young man who was now as consumed by the case as Linda was, had told her there was no trace of Eddie in recent records. It's like he vanished again, the officer had said, his voice trailing off, frustration evident. But Linda knew something else. She knew Eddie's past, his secrets, and, above all, the quarry. It was always the quarry. Back in the small town, life was trying to return to some semblance of normalcy. The discovery of Jake's truck had rocked the town, but it also left everyone questioning how they had missed something so obvious for so many years. The case became a local legend, and whispers about Jake's disappearance, the murder, and Eddie's involvement echoed through every corner of the town. Yet, no one knew the full truth. Linda didn't care about the town's gossip anymore. She was done with waiting, done with wondering. She had come too far to turn back now. If Eddie Harris thought he could hide forever, he was wrong. Linda was a mother, a wife, and a woman who had been living in limbo for far too long. She stood on the edge of the quarry and took a deep breath, the cool air of the evening wrapping around her. The answers were still out there, waiting for her to dig deeper. She had already uncovered the biggest part of the puzzle. The person responsible for Jake's death had been hiding in plain sight, just like the truck had. Eddie might have gotten away with murder all those years ago, but Linda would keep digging until she found him. Even if it took her another 20 years, she would not rest. Not until she knew the full truth. She turned and walked away from the quarry, the setting sun casting long, fading rays on the path in front of her. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in 2 decades, Linda finally felt like she was moving forward. The past, the grief, the uncertainty, they were no longer in control of her. She would find Eddie, and when she did, she would make him face the consequences of what he had done. For Jake, for herself, for Emma, and, most importantly, for the truth.